No one noticed her when she arrived, not beyond a passing glance. She wore no insignia, no badge, no patch, no rank. She walked with the quiet rhythm of someone used to shadows, someone who had spent more time in dirt than on carpet. Her boots were standard issue, but the way they moved spoke of terrain, not pavement, and though her hands looked soft, her eyes did not. They were scanning, calculating, seeing everything, and giving nothing away. She was just the woman in the corner to them, probably. Logistics, maybe intelligence, maybe a misfiled clerk, someone to ignore a bit. That was before the unit was called to the range that morning, before the commander showed up late and laughing, before he noticed her standing there, arms crossed, quiet and unbothered, while the team unpacked their rifles, prepped their gear, and joked among themselves. She said nothing. While the SEALs lined up for the shooting drills, she watched without judgment. When one missed a little left, when another adjusted too much and overcompensated, she stood with her back to the sun, no clipboard, no orders, no introduction. Some of them eventually asked who she was, and when she replied only with a name, no rank, just a name, they laughed, not cruel but dismissive. And when someone handed her a rifle as a joke, she took it without a word and walked to the line, the same line they had used, the same targets. Still standing, she lifted the rifle with a steadiness that did not match her size, her build, or the way she had been ignored. She aimed once, breathed once, and fired. The first shot cracked like thunder, and the first target dropped with perfect precision, and then the second and the third, each shot faster than the last, tighter grouping than any of them had landed that morning. Be the fourth shot. The jokes had stopped by the fifth. The silence had grown by the sixth. The commander himself stepped forward, his arms crossed, not laughing now, and when she hit the final target in a blind position, one no one had touched all day, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowed, trying to place her, trying to remember where he had seen that kind of precision, that kind of quiet control. She turned and handed the rifle back, calm, steady, and still not offering anything more than her name. It was then that the commander hesitated, and then with a sharp motion he raised his hand and saluted her. No one understood it, not at first, not until he said quietly, only one unit trains that shot, and she walked away without another word. Team stood frozen, and the silence around the range was not about embarrassment or pride, but realization that they had just watched something they could not explain, and someone they should never have underestimated. First she left the range. The men stood in a stillness that felt heavier than silence, the kind that stretches after something happens that no one wants to admit. They did not understand. The commander turned slowly, eyes fixed on the distance where her figure had disappeared into the edge of the compound, his voice low, like it was speaking more to memory than to his team. He said her name again, softer this time, and it was not a name he should have known, but he did, and that alone changed everything back in the barracks. The story spread fast, whispers about the woman with no insignia, the one who shot cleaner than anyone in the unit and left without a word. Some joked about it, trying to reclaim some pride. Others stayed quiet, piecing things together, watching the commander more closely now, seeing the way his demeanor shifted every time someone mentioned her. They started to sense it was not just that she was good, it was that she had been somewhere they had not, that she had seen things, done things none of them could talk about, not even the commander. He pulled one of the senior operators aside that night, a guy who had been in for 16 years, seen it all, or so he thought, and said, "Do not speak her name again," just that, and walked off. And the message landed like a weight across the whole room, because now it was clear this was not some fluke, not some prodigy that wandered in and got lucky. This was something deeper, something classified, and none of them liked how small that made them feel. Meanwhile, she walked through the southern edge of the base unnoticed again, this time heading toward the training quarters, not the official ones, but the old cleared hangar used only by the most elite teams when they needed space and silence. She moved like someone who had been there before, not recently, but enough times that muscle memory led the way. She had no badge to swipe, no key to turn, but the door opened for her anyway, and the lights came on slow, as if even the place knew her name and chose to listen. Inside the hangar there were only shadows and racks and a single board on the wall marked with initials that most people on base would not recognize, each set of letters carved with a blade, not a pen, faded, some gone entirely. She walked past them, her fingers tracing one near the bottom almost invisible, and then she sat at the far corner under the only vent that worked in summer and waited in our past, then another, and still she sat until a man entered, gray in his beard, but sharp in his stance. He said no hello, only asked you ready, and she nodded once and stood. He handed her a sealed folder, unmarked and thin, and said one word, green light, and the meaning behind it made her face change, not with fear, not with excitement, but with purpose, the kind that meant everything was now in motion. The folder sat in her lap for a full minute untouched, and opened, her thumb resting against the seal like she was feeling the weight of what was inside before she even saw it. The man with the gray in his beard stood in the doorway watching her, but not rushing her. He had seen her in the field years ago, seen what she could do with one shot, seen what she could do with no weapon at all, and now as he watched her stare at the folder, he saw the same stillness, the same focus. It never left her, not even after all that time off-grid. When she finally opened the folder, it was with the care of someone diffusing something, not paper, but something wired and dangerous, because that is exactly what it was. One name, one location, one blurry photo, and a line of coordinates underneath it. Nothing more and nothing less, and yet enough for her to know exactly what kind of mission this would be. Not a kill order, not yet, but not a rescue either. It was the kind of job that fell into no category, the kind that never got filed and could never be denied if someone asked about it. Ladder stood, closed the folder, and handed it back. No questions, no protest. The man nodded and stepped aside, letting her pass. No good luck, no stay safe, because they both knew those words meant nothing. Where she was going, she walked into the night, her pace calm like someone heading to dinner, not deployment. Her gear was already prepped, her mind already years ahead of the brief. She had read it once, and it would not leave her now, not until it was beneath the edge of the tarmac. A small, unmarked plane waited, blades idle, cabin dark. The pilot gave no salute, just a glance and a tilt of the head, and she stepped in, ducked low, and took the back seat away from the window, not for comfort, but for memory. Fewer views, fewer distractions, more focus. The engines began to hum, and within minutes they were airborne, heading into weather that promised no kindness. Thousands of miles away, in a camp built to vanish before it could ever be found, a man sat in a tent, breathing slow, watching a fire burn low. He held no weapon, he wore no uniform, but his eyes were the kind that never blinked long, and his hand twitched every few seconds like it remembered something, even when he did not. His name was not in any system anymore, wiped clean or buried deep enough that only one kind of person could find it. And now she was coming back in the air. She sat with her eyes closed, but not asleep. She was moving through landscapes in her mind, terrains, climates, threats, rehearsing them all, calculating routes, entries, exits, wind speed, and shadow position. She did not need maps. Her brain was its own battlefield, and everything she had learned from every mission before was stacking quietly, waiting for her to say when, and when would be soon. The plane touched down without lights, without sound, the wheels kissing the dirt of an unmarked strip somewhere between what boarders would call dangerous and what she called familiar. She stepped off before the door fully opened, her boots sinking into the dust like they had been waiting for her. The air was thick, people with heat and something older, the smell of history soaked into the ground. She scanned the horizon without turning her head, just her eyes reading everything, reading everyone, though no one was there to see her. A jeep rolled up from the dark, no headlights, no engine sound, just the crunch of sand under tires. The driver wore no insignia, just mirrored sunglasses. Even though it was night, he said nothing, just nodded and motioned to the back, and she climbed in like she had done this 100 times before, because she had. The jeep moved fast, without bouncing, taking turns without signaling, and stopped outside a compound that looked abandoned from the outside, but she knew better inside the walls. There were no guards, no cameras, only eyes watching from the dark. No greetings, no questions, just the sound of her boots on stone, until she reached a door marked with nothing and stepped through to a room lit by a single lamp and a map spread across a table. The man she met there was not the one who had handed her the folder. This man was younger, sharp in a different way, like a blade made in secret, not tested in war but trusted with secrets. He pointed to a spot on the map and said this is where he disappeared, and she knew death terrain was rough, unforgiving cliffs and canyons and choke points made to trap any normal force, but she was not bringing a force, she was going alone as always because a team left. Footprints, a team made noise, she moved like wine, like thought, like something you felt but never saw, and that was the point. She studied the map once, then again, but upside down, and then closed her eyes and built it inside her mind piece by piece. Not to remember it, but to become. I'd asked her one question, "Are you sure you want this one?" And she looked at him like he had just asked her if she remembered how to breathe and said nothing, because if he had to ask then he did not understand. And there was no time left to explain it. She left the room the same way she came in, silent, fast, her pack already on her back, her weapon broken down into pieces inside hidden pouches, her mind already days ahead, walking trails that had not yet been walked, seeing enemies who had not yet raised their weapons. Bare dawn, she was gone, and no one in the compound saw her leave, and when the sun rose the place looked empty again, like it had been abandoned for years, and maybe that was the way this all worked. Maybe the best stories were the ones that could never be told, and the best soldiers were the ones you never knew where their trail was not marked on any map, not even the one she had memorized, because it had not existed. When that map was drawn, it was the kind of path shaped by time and conflict, by boots and wheels and fire. It twisted through terrain that tried to erase it with wind and stone, but she moved through it like it was carved into her bones, her steps. Careful, never urgent, never loud, every shift of weight, every bend of her knee calculated, like a sniper's breath before the trigger breaks. Days passed without a word, without a sound. She moved only at night, resting by day beneath rock formations, or inside narrow caves that offered little comfort but perfect concealment. She ate sparingly, not because of rationing, but because hunger sharpened her instincts and dulled everything that did not matter. Her eyes missed nothing, every flick of movement, every pattern of bird flight, every sudden silence in the brush told her something, and she logged it all without ever writing it down. In the fourth night, she reached the outer ring of the sector where the signal had last been traced. It was not a place known to host life, and yet the signs were their footprints that did not match local footwear. The smell of burnt fabric carried faint on the air, a broken branch where there should have been none. Someone had passed through recently, and not carefully. She crouched low, touched the soil, ran it between her fingers, and turned east. The wind whispered a confirmation. A mile out, she spotted the watchpost hidden beneath a canopy of synthetic mesh and broken foliage. It was not military issue, not official, but built with purpose by hands that knew how to disappear. She counted to figures, both armed, both lazy in their posture, because they had not yet learned to fear someone like her. She waited, breathing slow, letting the rhythm of the earth settle into her chest before she moved again, and when she did, it was not forward but around, always around. The next rise gave her a perfect view, not of the men but of their line of sight, and more importantly their blind spots. She approached from below, crawling without rush, using the shadows of the rocks and the movement of clouds to time each advance. 1 minute passed, then 5, and by the 7th she was beneath the platform. She reached up, silent, steady, took hold of the structure and waited. 1 breath to 3, then she pulled herself up and was beside them before their ears caught the sound. They never saw her. The first man dropped without knowing why. The second reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Her hand on his wrist, pressure applied precisely, and his body shut down, not unconscious, just empty. She left them there, weapons disabled, calms destroyed, eyes open, but minds shaken. They would talk, she was sure of it, and what they said would spread through the hills like fire, and with it the legend of the ghost who walked without name, without orders, without sound. She moved on. The path led her deeper into the canyon, walls rising on either side like forgotten monuments built by a war no one claimed anymore. The air changed, became still heavier, like even the wind had learned not to whisper here, and yet she moved as if the silence welcomed her, as if every rock and every shadow already knew her name, even if no one else did. She followed the trail by feel, not by sight, her boots landing in the places only someone trained to vanish would choose. Spotted the next sign by accident, or perhaps not accident at all, a single drag mark across a smooth patch of sand, too deliberate, too Be natural to careless to be done by someone like her. It was a message, not a mistake, and she paused, studying the angle, the weight, the pressure left behind. It spoke of resistance, of a body being pulled, not carried, and her jaw clenched, not in fear, but recognition. She was cautious, dropped to her stomach, eyes scanning the ridge above where two figures shifted in and out of moonlight like they wanted to be seen, like bait, and she refused to take it. Instead, she watched, timed their movements, traced their arcs, and calculated the distance to the center of their sweep. The moment one turned his back, she moved not forward but down, sliding beneath the edge of a dry river bed where the ground had cracked into a narrow spine just wide enough to hold her. Shepesh crawled for hours without lifting her head, fingers reading the terrain like braille. Her breath paced, her movements steady, never rushed, never reckless, until she reached a break in the ridge, and there she saw the camp, not large but efficient perimeter set with motion wire and watchtowers disguised as dead trees. Men moved inside, but not casually, with discipline, with timing. These were trained fighters, not locals, not smugglers, and that changed everything. She marked every post, every patrol route, every pattern, until the map lived behind her eyes. Then she slid back the way she came, slow, silent, until the ridge swallowed the camp from sight. Once hidden again, she pulled a small device from her belt, no bigger than a coin. She tapped it once, a red light blinked once, then stopped. No signal sent, no transmission made, just a marker for something that would come later if needed. She needed more than eyes now, she needed a voice, and for that she turned east, where an old contact lived, not in name, not in code, but in fire, light, and silence. A tracker older than any record and harder to find than any myth. She moved without rest through the dark, letting instinct guide her feet, knowing he would find her first because he always did. And sure enough, by dawn a figure appeared beside her, as if he had always been walking there, waiting for her to catch up. Said nothing, just nodded and pointed to the sky where a trail of smoke rose thin and straight and wrong. She nodded back, and without speaking they changed direction, not because of the smoke, but because of what it meant. Something had moved, something had broken silence, and when that happened, the rules changed, the clock started, and the margin, FO or error, vanished. They moved together without needing words. The tracker led with the kind of instinct no machine could mimic, and she followed, not behind but beside, because trust did not come from orders or rank. It came from history and survival, from scars earned. In silence they moved fast now, not recklessly but with urgency, because the smoke in the sky was not a signal, it was a scar, and scars meant something had been wounded recently and might not survive long. Terrain grew cruel as the hours passed. Jagged stone gave way to slick earth and twisted roots, but neither stumbled. They climbed and dropped, slid and rolled through places that tore at clothing and skin like claws, but neither winced, neither paused. Each scrape and bruise was simply a message from the ground telling them they were getting closer. They reached a ridge just before dusk and lay flat at the top, eyes scanning the valley below. What they saw was not a camp, not a patrol, not even an ambush. It was a scene to clean, to quiet. A single vehicle smoldered in the center, surrounded by bodies. None moved, not even the smoke seemed eager to rise, as if the air itself did not want to disturb the stillness. She reached for her scope, adjusted it, slowly counted 5, then 6, then 7 hostiles on the perimeter, none in uniform, all holding weapons, the kind that left no serial number. She watched their patterns, short, loose patrols, eyes lazy, confidence born from repetition. They were waiting for something or someone, and she knew who that someone was. It was her. They had burned the signal as a lure, and it had worked, but not how they expected. They thought they would draw out a scout, maybe a recon unit. Instead, they had drawn her, and that meant their math was off by 1, and that 1 would make all the difference. She spoke, then her voice soft, her words few. The tracker nodded, handed her a roll of cloth from his pack. Inside were tools, small, precise, efficient. She assembled the rifle in under a minute each. Movement practiced to the point of instinct. She checked the wind, adjusted her scope, then breathed in slowly, like drawing the world into her lungs before letting it go one piece at a time. The first shot was not loud, it was barely a whisper, but It cut through the valley like lightning. The first guard dropped before the others understood what had happened. The second fell as confusion turned to panic. The third and fourth tried to run, but they chose the wrong direction, the wrong cover. Because they had trained for firefights, not ghosts. When it was over, she exhaled and lowered the rifle. The valley silent again, but different now, not still, but empty. She rose without a word, the tracker behind her like a shadow. They moved down the ridge to confirm what she already knew. There would be no survivors because she never left questions behind, and the message had been sent somewhere far from that ridge. A commander checked his watch, then looked to the horizon and smiled because he knew she had arrived. They left the valley without haste, not because they were careless, but because haste was unnecessary now. The mission had changed again, as it always did when she was involved. The tracker said nothing as they moved, just glanced up once toward the ridgeline behind them and then forward toward the hills that rolled like waves beneath the weight of forgotten battles. She felt the shift to not in the wind or the terrain, but in her own pulse, steady, focused, no longer hunting, but being drawn toward something else, something unfinished. At mid-morning, they reached a clearing with a rusted radio tower leaning like it had grown tired of standing. The ground around it had been scorched once long ago, but the burned scars were old, the kind that told stories in ash rather than flame, and there they waited, not because they had to, but because waiting was part of the language. Now a conversation in stillness and silence. The first sound came hours later. A low hum followed by the rhythmic chop of blades cutting through air. She looked up as the Black Hawk broke the horizon, its markings muted, no unit insignia, no numbers, just shadow and purpose. It hovered low enough to bend the grass and dust into a spiral before settling. The door slid open, revealing only one man, tall, broad, with eyes like stone and the stance of someone who had spent more time giving orders than receiving them. She approached without a salute, without a word, and he nodded once, the kind of nod that carried years of weight, that spoken memories and unspoken truths. Then he stepped aside, allowing her to enter without question, because whatever came next required only one thing, her presence. The tracker remained behind, watching from the trees as the helicopter lifted into the sky, taking her away again, as it always did. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. The hum of the engine drowned all thought, and she sat still, eyes closed, breathing slow, conserving energy for whatever would come next. The man across from her finally leaned forward and handed her a folder, unmarked, sealed. She opened it, scanned the contents, and did not react, not when she saw the location, not when she saw the name, and especially not when she saw the photograph paper clipped to the back. It was never about reaction, it was about readiness. Briefing was short. They never needed many words. She was to drop in alone, gather intel, confirm status, eliminate threats if confirmed hostile, and extract with no trace. Clean, silent, final, the usual, except this time there was one difference. The name on the folder was familiar, not a friend, not an enemy, something else, someone once thought buried by time and distance, now resurfaced with questions only she could answer. As the helicopter dipped low toward a desert basin, she secured her gear, adjusted her scope, and stared out the open side, watching the horizon shift with every turn, knowing that what waited below was not just another mission, it was the past, disguised as an assignment. And this time the shot might not be the hardest part, it might be what came after, if anything came at all. The basin stretched wide and silent beneath the chopper, the wind carving slow lines through the sand like ancient script written and erased by the same invisible hand. The helicopter banked hard, then dropped altitude and hovered just long enough for her to jump, boots hitting the ground in a soft roll that sent dust curling around her like smoke. She rose without pause, scanning the terrain, her senses adjusting to the dry air, the heat, the silence, to perfect, to careful. She moved with purpose, crossing dunes and outcroppings until she reached the old structure, half sunken in earth, its walls scorched by time and weather. Once a safe house, maybe now a tomb, or worse, something waiting. She stepped inside, rifle ready, eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. She found signs of struggle, overturned furniture, dried blood, a shattered calm unit, and in the corner a wall marked with coordinates, scratched and hasty. She studied them, memorized them, then turned to leave when she heard a single footstep outside, not loud but placed with intent. She froze, rifle raised, breath held. The door creaked just slightly and she stepped into the opening fast, silent weapon trained on the silhouette outside. It was a boy young, no older than 13, his hands up, his mouth trembling, but his eyes locked on hers with something she had not seen in a long time, recognition. He whispered a name, her name, the one she had abandoned years ago, the one buried with the last file they ever wrote about her. She lowered her weapon slowly, eyes narrowing, and asked him where he heard that name. He pointed east toward the mountains. His voice, barely a thread, said he had been told to wait, that she would come, that she always came, and that when she did he should say the name and lead her home. Ash hesitated only a second, then followed him through ravines and dried river beds, the sun burning down hard, but her mind sharper with every step. This was not coincidence, this was design, and the boy was a message in motion, a breadcrumb leading back to something unfinished, something to quiet, to ignore. They walked for hours until dusk turned the world copper and the shadows long. Finally they reached a cave carved into the rock. Above its entrance hung a thread of fabric, sun-bleached and torn, but she recognized the pattern. It was once part of a flag, a unit flag. Long thought lost, she crouched low, motion the boy to stay, then slipped inside. The dark swallowed her, but she moved like it was daylight, her hands finding the familiar path through tunnels that memory refused to forge at hand. Then she heard it, a voice, low, tired but sharp, saying her name again, and not in fear, not in warning, but in relief. She stepped into the chamber and saw him, the man once thought dead, seated against the wall, wounded but alive, and in his eyes was the same recognition she had seen in the boy, as if the past had not only survived but waited. She did not speak right away, she just stood there, rifle lowered, heart steady, but her mind running through a dozen questions, none of which had answers that made sense. Yet he looked the same, older, yes, thinner, worn by something more than time, but still him, the same man who had once taught her how to disappear, how to move like smoke through enemy lines, how to breathe with the wind and fire only when silence mattered most. Smiled weakly, eyes flicking to her shoulder where no patch, no rank, no mark existed, and then he laughed, not out of joy but disbelief, like some part of him had never truly expected her to walk through that cave again. She knelt beside him, checked the wound. It was clean but deep and old enough that infection was trying to win the war. His breath hitched as she touched it, but he said nothing, only nodded toward the boy waiting just outside the cave. On Transea found me 2 weeks ago, the man said, his voice ragged, told me he knew where you were, said someone sent him. I thought I was hallucinating, but he had your name, and he said it like it meant something, like it was still alive out there. She didn't respond, not yet. Her focus stayed on cleaning the wounds, sealing it best she could, while her thoughts circled back to who could have known where to send the boy, who would have dared. Once the bleeding slowed and he leaned back against the stone, she asked the question that had sat in her chest since she saw his face. Why did you vanish? Why fake your death? Why let everyone think you were gone? His eyes narrowed, not in anger but pain, and he answered with a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, even in the dark, even now, because I saw what was coming, he said, and I knew I had to disappear or they'd come for all of us, and you were devaluable. They would have used you against me, or worse. He swallowed hard, not out of emotion, but because the world she'd built on silence and shadow had just shifted its foundation, and now she realized she had been circling this truth for years. Every mission, every ghost contact, every coded message that made no sense until now. He reached into a pocket, pulled out a folded paper worn thin from time and sweat, and handed it to her. Inside were coordinates, a name and a call sign she had not heard since her last classified deployment. It was not a request, it was a final piece of a puzzle long buried and now unearthed like a mine waiting to detonate. She tucked the paper into her vest, stood and told the boy to keep watch while she rigged the entrance in case someone else tried to follow. The man closed his eyes, not to sleep but to rest in the only peace he had known since the day he vanished. And as she stepped back into the fading light, rifle on her back, mission forming again in her mind, she knew this was no longer about orders. This was about finishing what someone else had started, and what only she could end. Morning came without color, just gray sky and wind moving low across the Rocks as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She stood outside the cave, silent, motionless, eyes scanning the horizon for movement, for dust or signal, for any shape that broke the stillness. The boy slept behind her, curled in a blanket, too big for his frame, and the man rested deeper in the cave, hidden, safe for now, though the safety was borrowed and thinner. Mind turned over the coordinates again, the name, the call sign, all pieces that led to a place she had once sworn to never return, to a base that officially no longer existed on a map that was burned the day it was built, a place where silence was law and people like her were trained, then forgotten or erased. If they ever broke the rules, she knew the route it would take her. 3 days cross-country through land where signals died and help never came, for she left. She placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder, told him to stay quiet, stay hidden, stay alive. She looked once more at the man who had once been her mentor and now her burden and her responsibility and maybe her redemption. Then she turned and began to walk, the rifle light across her back, her boots finding rhythm in the dust and stone like they always died. As the sun rose higher, she remembered the last time she had been there, how it had ended in blood and silence and a chopper that never arrived, how she had walked away with wounds no medic could see and secrets too heavy to carry, and yet she had survived, not because of orders, not because of rank, but because someone had to, and she had always been. Sumioneth path narrowed into a canyon, dry and hot and echoing with the sound of her footsteps like ghosts following too close. She passed old markers carved into rock, symbols only those trained like her would recognize, and at the end of the canyon she found the first one waiting, dark clothes, no insignia, face covered, but stance ready like a question and an answer at the same time. Did not speak, just nodded once, turned and began walking, and she followed without a word, because this was how they spoke, how they moved, how they lived, and the silence between them meant more than any conversation ever could. They reached a ridge where 3 more waited, and now the air shifted. Because they were not here by accident, they had come because the call sign had reached them too, because the unfinished mission had echoed louder than any command. She met their eyes, each one, and saw the same thing: purpose, memory, scars, and readiness. They did not salute, they did not speak her name, they just began to move as if they had always known she would come. And as they descended the other side of the ridge toward the place where it would all either end or begin again, she felt something return to her, not trust, not hope, but certainty, and that was a Nov compound, looked abandoned from a distance, half buried in sand, the roof sagging, the wire fence twisted like time had pulled at it with tired hands. But she knew better, they all did. The others moved without speaking, taking positions that had once been drilled into them in another life, in a place without names or borders. She crouched behind a broken wall, glass crunching under her boots, and pulled the scope to her eye. The building was not dead, it was dormant, hiding its breath in the heat. Movement inside, barely a flicker, but enough someone was watching, and they had been watching for a long time. She signed one short, sharp fingers, and the team fanned out, becoming shadows, each one a different shape of silence. She stayed low, heart steady, not because she was fearless, but because this moment had lived inside her since the day she walked away from this place, knowing it was not over. The breach was clean, fast. No sound beyond the whisper of boots and the wind pressing against cracked doors. The first room was empty, the second full of dust and forgotten gear, but the third held the truth, not in people, but in files, maps, lists, names, and among them hers. Scribbled across a page with a single word next to it, a Seth. Rage was quiet, not hot or wild, but cold and exact. It moved through her veins like memory, and her fingers moved faster, flipping pages, finding what she needed: a location, a date, an operation that never officially happened, and a signature she remembered too well, not his, but someone above, someone who had signed away lives like they were lines on a report. Took the drive from the desk, pocketed it, and nodded to the others. They swept the place clean, wiped every trace, and left it as they found it, broken and buried and still pretending to be forgotten. By the time the sun dipped low, they had made it back to the ridge, and from their split without words, disappearing again into the spaces they came from, all except her. She turned toward the east, toward the place where the man still waited in the cave, and the boy still listened for danger in his sleep. She reached them by nightfall, stepped into the cave, and sat beside the Man who opened his eyes and asked only one question, "Did you find it?" She nodded past him the drive and the paper and waited while he read slowly, face changing not with shock but with something harder understanding. He looked up at her eyes full of a weight only they could carry and said, "It is Timothy." Burned the paper, kept the drive, and walked out together, not as ghosts, not as soldiers, but as something the world never had a name for, people without rank, without name, without place, but who carried the memory of what had been done and what would never be allowed again. The wind rose behind them, carried the smoke across the valley, and in the darkness the firelight caught the faint outline of a salute, not from him but from her. And it meant everything.